Hey everybody, welcome to the Marquez Says Show. I'm your host, Marquez Mosher, and this is my co-host, cohort, and eldest son, Austin Mosher. He and I always seem to bring out the feisty side of each other, and it leads to some very spirited conversations. There's never really any one topic. We see the world from many different perspectives, and sometimes we agree, and sometimes we don't. Either way, it gets very interesting, so sit back, relax, and have a bit of fun at our expense as we explore some of the most unexpected perspectives you'll ever hear about the world we live in. So, let's get started. Hey, Marquez Says time. Welcome to the Marquez... What? Go ahead.
You managed to make Bill Cosby sound even creepier.
That was not... No, don't even... that's scary. Ugh.
It's what it sounded like.
Hey!
Oh, God, we're getting canceled. It's right after...
How are you enjoying your drink, Austin? Yeah, there. Anyway, welcome to the Marquez Says Show. I am Marquez. He is Austin. Say hello, Austin.
Hello. How we doing? We having a good day out there?
So we basically wasted a whole episode before this as we were talking about what we were going to talk about.
That's true.
So we're going to hopefully rehash stuff, and we're going to be able to kind of argue it away, and I don't know. It's a little different. It all stemmed from a post that I recently did that generated some different opinions, to say the least. And some of it's like fundamentally macro, and some of it micro, as in the trendy terms of today. But I'll read it real quick, just so that everybody's on the same page. What you are hearing are the echoes of an obscene bygone era when the cries of tradition, heritage, and law and order are made to defend the indefensible. As a nation, we can never go back. We must stop this mangled, nostalgic mentality from pervading our society any longer. The only thing it accomplishes is to take our society back to a time of prejudice, racism, discrimination, bigotry, and worst of all, a willful and accepted ignorance. We must continue to move forward, fight, and eliminate these dangerous and divisive calls of the past. There is no other way if we want to fulfill the promise of a better future for everyone. Now, I was specifically meaning that more towards the aspect of when people talk about, the good old days, and specifically in our climate, much more about the racial situation. When you hear about the law and order, and you hear, things of that sort. And that was more of what it was specifically targeted to. But it was a general statement as well, because I've always had a problem when people talk about the good old days and how, quote unquote, the good old days, we should go back to it, and, marriages, and talking about relationships and society. And it's always struck me as just odd that when people talked about going back to, when I was growing up, it was more of like in the 80s and 90s. So it was talking about going back to the 60s, 70s, and even 50s. And I called it that mangled nostalgia because I, as much as anyone, would love to go back in time and live during those times. But I also realize now, though, that some things that we think were only isolated to then aren't, and things that we thought didn't happen then did. And that's kind of where Austin and I were talking about that. Is the world better off today? And as a whole, I said yes. I just said that inevitably we're better off today in almost every aspect. And you were saying that, well, that may be true in a grand scheme. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are better than, there's something to be said. I'm not trying to correct me with the words I'm putting, but you're basically saying that there is something to be said for the good old days if we learn from it in a very targeted type of way.
Right. Well, we were talking about macro versus micro, and yes, macro, we are better off today than we would have been maybe, 50 years ago or something like that. But I do think on a micro level, just like with anything, there are things that we could improve upon that might not have been, or that are not as good today as they might have been.
Right.
Maybe 50, 60, whatever years ago.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, we both actually agree. We actually do agree on the actual subject, so to speak, overall. But I'm looking at it, I'm trying to minimize the amount of people, quote unquote, of thought that says that we need to go back to a time XYZ. And because I feel that that's just in a detrimental. It's yes, there may be things, you're right, to be learned from the past, and I don't disagree with that, because obviously if we don't learn from the past, we're destined to repeat it. So absolutely, but that's the point, is I think that we should learn those lessons and build upon them, and also recognize the positivity of where we are now and where we've come. We're not nearly as far as we could have been, or nearly as far as we should be. But I definitely feel that we need to believe that we have progressed, that we are in a better place, and that this nostalgia of going backwards and thinking about, you know, the 60s and or the 50s, about, you know, my mom and pop stayed together for 45 years. You know what? There is some instances where that was true. It was a good, solid relationship. But nowadays, because I don't think human nature changes tremendously, that now we know that mom and pop had a horrible relationship. Whether one of them was drunk, one of them may have been popping pills, one of them was cheating on those business trips. But because of society's parameters, there was no option for divorce. There was no option to speak about it. There was no way for that man or woman, although mostly woman, if it was an abusive relationship, to get help. And I think people tend to just completely gloss over that by just saying relationships don't, you know, they aren't the way they used to be. And it's kind of like, well, that's maybe a good thing, you know, having a 20-year relationship or a short relationship, because the woman left because she was getting beat or cheated on, or the guy for that matter.
I feel like it's a big assumption. We just don't know. And that's why it's like, yeah, it could have been happening. Yeah, it could be happening today. It probably did happen then. It probably does happen today. Well, it definitely did happen then, and it definitely happens today. I
think we know it happened because it happens today.
Right. It
and
definitely
I don't see
did
why
happen.
it wouldn't have changed. I mean, yes, I'm sure you could argue the, you know, morals today.
It does happen less today. I would just venture to guess because, one, like what you said, this is a good way to illustrate it. If everything is better, how could it be better if the same thing is happening today as it did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago?
No, and that's true. When I say everything is better, is that we've learned from it. I'm saying that we do have less 40-year relationships, but it's not because of a diminished value system. It's because it becomes more obvious. The guy gets caught.
Multiple things happening at one time, though. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. It's not so absolute.
Well, I think in general, I mean, that may be true, but I think in general, by just supporting my theory, or what you talked about in your question, is that, again, when people talk about looking back or going back, and then, you know, they wish that we were more like XYZ, that's just a romanticizing of that life was simpler. Life wasn't simpler, or the world wasn't simpler. Their life might have been simpler, but the world itself wasn't any simpler. And you could argue, you know, that well, no, the nuclear threat today, or cyber attacks, or the technology, yes, those didn't exist, depending on how far back you go. But something of its equivalence for that time did. So you still had that same concept, I guess, relatively speaking. You still had a world that was dealing with all of the same issues.
Yeah. Well, then we get into a philosophical debate about relativism.
A little bit. It's a little bit. But,
and if it's really the same thing or not.
Yeah, but I think you can go back in history and talk about, do countries war? Yes. Does religion at odds with science? Yes. You just go through all of the traditional things, and they may have changed. The playing field may have changed, but ultimately, it's the same concepts. I mean, right now we're reliving it again about civil rights. I was listening to a radio show on the way here, and the guy was talking about, why are we fighting for, he was talking about black people, saying, why are we fighting for our rights? These are rights that should have been given to us. We should already have them. We shouldn't be fighting for them. And just how insane that statement is that we're having to fight for our rights. And that's the same thing that's been said for hundreds of years. So that's just kind of an example. And and more than anything is that I believe that the hesitancy, my big hesitancy is when I hear people talk about, we need to go back. Or the arguments now are about that, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So in other words, nowadays, well, we shouldn't throw away the good just to get rid of the bad. Well, I would almost go duh. But to turn around,
it's like common sense.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Like, well, and then when people do stuff like that, in my opinion, what I see a lot of times is they're trying to put words in your mouth. They're trying to set you up to basically discredit what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we kind of have to just, and a testament to you, and I might not have seen it. I was obviously, we had this conversation, we argued about it. I didn't see it at first because I was ready to attack on it, but you didn't, and that was the right thing to do.
And that was hard.
Yeah, well,
in the world of social media, and just for me, this is something we obviously share. You and I both share that I don't want to let something go. I really don't. I don't ever want to let something go, and I really want to keep it going, whether it's competitiveness or whatever the case may be.
Same, and I'm not really usually willing to let it go until somebody tells me I'm right, and that's not. And that's honestly, and it's wrong. I shouldn't need that. Nobody should. Yeah, nobody should need that sort of validation. And then honestly, a lot of maybe you're not, and you need to be okay with that. And I'm not saying you. I'm really speaking to myself. For those not watching, there's a mirror right in front of the mic.
Oh, hey, remember, a lot of people would argue that as we're sitting here facing each other, there's a mirror as well. So and a
funhouse mirror, a scary one.
Hey, now, you're making me skinny, right? That's
exactly. Yeah, you're already skinny.
We're talking about with that concept of I lost my train of thought with social media. That it's taken me a long time before now that where I can disengage, and it's still hard because I'll disengage, end a conversation, step away from it, but for the next day I'm still thinking what I could have said. Well, I could go back. I could say this and stuff, and you can't. I mean, in life, like you said, that's hard enough. But with social media, where you have the ability to where you could type it at any time, and anyway, I guess that's not getting too off track because that's the point about when someone says.
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
No, when they're like we were talking about when someone says when they're approaching it, they are trying to. It's their way. It's a soft way, a disguised way of basically saying, well, we shouldn't just flip flop the situation. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. All of these things are essentially designed to provoke the response, like you said, of, well, okay, I guess you're right. I guess it would be nice to have XYZ back. And then it's, haha, see, the good old days were good, and that's why we should go back to them, or that's what we should. And what's good from the good old days is still good. It's not gone. It's still here.
Right.
And I think, but that's where you may not see it. You may not have it as relevant in your life, but it hasn't gone away.
See, and that statement right there is what triggered our argument for a very long time. Because I don't necessarily share that belief. I don't think that they're completely gone. I do think there are a lot of things that are diminished today, and this is just from what I see in my world, being 20. How old am I? 22 in Los Angeles.
Soon 23. We'll wish him big happy birthday.
But so yes, it's not that they're gone. I don't think once an idea is put out into the world, let's get philosophical, it doesn't just go away. It exists forever. It's just who.
Is it like the internet?
It could be. It could be. We'll see. But yeah, like an idea, a value, it'll exist forever. Now, who uses it, who interprets it, whatever, that's up to them. And if it happens, it happens. I believe a lot of things. Okay, a big argument about the Constitution, right, is that it wasn't actually for everybody. It was only for landowning wealthy white men.
However, it was meant, those wealthy landowner white men were the ones who wrote it, and they are the ones who mostly benefited. But that argument, the counter argument, which is maybe where you're going, is that it was written so that it could be for everybody.
That's kind of where I'm going. I don't think they intentionally did it to where it could be for everybody. They did it only for themselves. It's just now in retrospect, we can take those principles, philosophies, and all that stuff and attribute them to everybody.
See, again, you're right. There's a fundamental difference that I'm going to look at it from the optimistic standpoint of that. No, I think that actually.
But it wasn't.
No,
These people
you can't-
weren't trying to do
no,
that.
No, you can't. No, that's not true. You don't know that they didn't want to do that. They were trying to do something bigger than themselves. But at the time, given the constraints of society, they were never going to be able to do that. They were never going to be able to push down that agenda, ending slavery at that moment
Okay,
when
but
we declared independence.
I would be more willing to believe that they wanted to attribute it to everybody if they didn't own those slaves. They didn't have to try to abolish slavery, but they still owned them and treated them poorly.
No,
George Washington, all these people, they didn't.
Yeah, no, again, that's what I'm saying, though, is that the two things can almost be true at one time. And although you did have a lot of those people there was a lot of the founding fathers, although obviously not the more notorious or the ones that are more famous. There was also a huge segment of society even then that was talking about slavery is wrong, abolition, et cetera, and that obviously got louder and bolder, and we know the rest of what happened with history.
Right. There's always going to be people on one side or the other, but the point is you're right. I do believe two things to be true at one time about the Constitution. One, it did what it was supposed to do for landowning white men at the time. Two, we can make that broader now. And this is the whole thing of like, well, we don't have to throw all of it away. There's good in there that we can recognize was not the intention or not actually practiced in that time period. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about what you were talking about, going back to the good old days of the 50s, 60s, my parents stayed together, whatever, family values, any of that stuff, they might not have been living them the right way at that time. But we can still take those same principles, same values, and do them the right way today for everybody.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Which is why I feel like we can't discredit everything that happened before. Because on a micro sense, we can take things and make them better today.
Right, and I think that's actually where we agree, because that's basically taking the good from something and building on it. I guess my point would be that those, like what you said, the values, whatever the values are that you're those parameters, that value package, we'll call it that mm-hmm. value package that wasn't necessarily being lived the way as fully as it could have been. Mm-hmm. That's my point, is that value package still exists today. Whereas some people would say that value package, that's the point of the value package, doesn't, or is diminished, or those who say that. Okay, actually, right. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Those who actually say that say, well, the values aren't the same today. Well, this is what you're saying, is that actually you're looking at the people that are not fully utilizing the value package as well as it could be.
Right.
Kind of like what they did back then.
Exactly.
Right.
But I would almost make an argument in some ways it's used even worse today, not necessarily as a whole, but in a lot of ways. Right. Because there's a lot of people that are going to say what you're saying about how, well, it didn't work back then. It's a broken system. I'm not going to adhere to it at all today. And then basically use that as justification to do whatever they want to do today.
Absolutely. I can totally get behind that.
Which is what a lot of people do, which is why I get hesitant whenever I hear the whole thing that you were saying about like, well, we can't go back. I don't want to go back, but I don't also want to just keep moving forward blindly, throwing all the other stuff away. No,
and I can actually absolutely get behind that, but that centers around, that comes back around to what my point is that those who are using it for excuses and crutches and using it, that as the ability to,
they don't think that it's that, though.
Exactly. But that's the point, though, is that they're actually looking for it so that they can use it to their advantage. I am saying look for it. Oh, that's exactly my point, mm-hmm. is that those who say we should go back, they're not looking for what is still good now. They're not looking for what could be better, like you said. Mm-hmm. They are concentrating on the fact that they see people using it as a crutch, as an excuse, as shade, mm-hmm. for them, as cover to do what they want to do. Mm-hmm. I agree with you. And that's my point, is that look beyond that. Yes, there's always people that are going to use things for their own purposes. So when I hear somebody saying, let's go back to that time, because people these days, they don't behave the way they used to. They don't have the same morals as they used to. That's not true. You're looking at the people and you're finding those who are supporting your argument, and we can go into the whole mm-hmm. cognitive bias and all that stuff. But if you take a step back and realize, which is what I was trying to get the point across, is that if you don't look back so nostalgically, and I say that mangled nostalgia, mm-hmm. and understand that the problems of the past are still problems of today, and the good things of the past are still the good things of today. It's how we shape them. We need to look and say, you know what? I wish, my parents stayed together for 40 years. I hope my marriage stays together for 40 years. And to your point, well, how do I make my marriage stay together for 40 years? It's not going to be because the woman feels like she can't leave, or it's not going to be because the church says you can't get divorced. It's not going to be because society would look down upon a divorced widow or widower or whatever. It's going to be because I'm committed to this relationship and communication. I'm committed to this relationship and making sure that I do things, not just selfishly, and I do things for the other person. Mm-hmm. Same result, same end result. It's this 40 years we have a relationship, but this time we took that value package, that moral of that package, and we used it the right way.
Right.
So that,
and I think that there probably were a lot of people doing that in the past.
There was.
I would say it's probably more people doing that than people taking advantage of it. But
see, again, that's where I would argue and say that no, I don't think they.
But there's no way to really know, and that's another thing. So it's all just speculation.
True, but there is the point of the fact that we don't. There's no reason to believe that, quote unquote, men or women, for whatever you want to say it, there's no real reason to believe that men cheat less now than they did then. Especially given that back then they probably had a higher probability of getting away with it, or being blatant about it, and not having to worry about any repercussions. If they cheated and their wife couldn't leave them for whatever reasons, financial, religious, societal.
We should have Googled that. I would have loved to have seen when divorce rates started to change.
But it was in the 80s. I actually know that one.
Oh, really?
They used to joke about the fact that
it's 50%.
like in California,
right?
It's actually not that anymore. It's which is funny because I used to always use that joke as a starter marriage. In California, you get a starter marriage,
right? Yeah.
But the divorce rates have actually gone down.
But, so it wasn't in like the feminist wave of like what was that? Would have been
that would have been the result.
60s, early 70s.
That was So that the 80s might have been a result of that when you had a whole nother generation. It may not have been the women because they may not have actually got involved, but the women that were born in the late 60s and 70s, by the time the 80s rolled around, they may have been influenced by it, or at least the women that were not so sure about it, because of course you got those forefront people in the late 60s and 70s. Yeah. So by the 80s, it became more mainstream where a woman could say, I'm leaving you. You treat me bad. Just for no other reason that we don't get along and you treat me bad. I'm leaving. And they had the financial ability to do so and stuff like that.
Right.
But that's part of you could say the divorce rates went up. Oh, that's a bad thing. Is it?
Well, yeah, the divorce rates going up don't necessarily mean it's a bad thing.
But some people, that would be their excuse for why we should go back. Because divorce rates have gone up, that means there's a breakdown of moral fiber.
Right, which is possible. However, and what I like to do is I when somebody says something like this, especially on the internet, I don't think that they're necessarily communicating what they're actually trying to say. Because there's no burden on you to really be all that articulate. Mm-hmm. So when somebody's saying, oh, well, marriage is worse because divorce rates are higher, that might not be what they're actually trying to say. They could be trying to say, maybe this is a fan because I'm Kanye West and I dissect what people are trying to say instead of what's actually being said. But like they might be saying, well, people are trying less, or people aren't willing to put in the work to do this. People aren't trying to compromise or try to communicate, or something like that, which is a real problem.
Yeah.
If somebody's being cheated on, beat, whatever, obviously those are all very serious things, and you should be allowed to handle that however you want to. But I that's when people are trying to communicate these certain things like, oh, divorce rates went up, therefore marriage is worse.
But again, that's my point. That comes back to my point that's what they're focusing on. That's what they're looking for.
Well, they might not know how to express otherwise.
Right. So that's why when they say something like that, and they say that usually is followed up with, I wish we were back in a time when XYZ. Mm-hmm. And that's my point of saying, no, don't wish for a time back in XYZ. Mm-hmm. How do you change it now? Because those divorces,
get to a better place in the future.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Right, and I think most generally people will. But so many people want to stagnate for whatever reason, personal or just the ease of it, fear of change. The list goes on and on and on. And so this post that I did was basically a blatant statement to say, put it up right in front of you. Don't go back. When you hear something like someone say Law and Order, I didn't realize this until, I don't know, maybe in the last decade, and that the call for Law and Order that Nixon did and stuff. I had heard that it wasn't about Law and Order, but it was, there was the underlying meanings to it and stuff. But I really didn't know that and stuff. But I learned it because I like to learn about history, and I like to kind of study history, and et cetera. And then all of a sudden, with all the parallels, and now we're hearing it again, and it's very clear, and a lot of people understand that. On the surface, it sounds good. It sounds like, well, what's wrong with Law and Order? Nothing at all. But when you're using it in a context that you're trying to say, we need to go, we need to go back to a time.
Message.
Yeah, we need to go back to a time where there was law and order, and the society was much more rigid, et cetera, et cetera. Well, even back then, it was used as a detriment for racial tensions.
And the biggest, most dangerous part of a phrase like Law and Order, any phrase of its kind to me, is there's a lot of sirens.
Yeah. Law and Order.
Yeah. It's really dangerous because there's a certain code behind it, right? And there's a meaning that's not being explicitly said. There's a certain outcome that somebody's trying to get, not all the time, but what I would like to venture is probably Donald Trump is trying to say. And if basically somebody goes, oh, well, no Law and Order. But then they go, oh, well, you're against all cops. You're against all this. They're trying. It's basically pushing you into a trap. It's like, no, that's not what we're saying. That's not what the point is. But it's basically setting you up so they can basically write you off as crazy.
Right.
Or you don't want this? What is wrong with this? Right. There's nothing wrong with this.
And you're absolutely right about that. And that's why
it's a trap.
It's a trap. It's a trap. But that's exactly that's why I to avoid that, essentially, is my meaning. Because I think if I say we can't go back, we cannot go backwards, we cannot try to defend the indefensible, and I'm being very clear about what aspects, the prejudice, the discrimination, it's absolutely asinine if anybody would take that as, so you're not going to take the good things? I mean, it's really beyond comprehension. It's beyond the conversation, whether or not in logic and stuff, for someone to go, so you're saying you don't want to go back. Well, what if going back, which is what probably triggered me when you said it, well, what if going back is actually better? I'm like, okay, well, two things there. One...
Well, I didn't say that.
No, but I mean the concept of that things could have been better in the past.
Right.
Which is so that triggered two things. One, okay, if something was better in the past... What I find, and what I said is that, well, why wouldn't it still be here? Like you said, a good concepts in general last. So just because something was good in the past, I would venture to gain that it's still good now. It's just whether or not it's as prevalent. Is it as recognizable? Is it as amplified as it might have been? Maybe not. Maybe you have to dig for it. But is it here? Yes. So saying that, well, we need to go back in the past in order to get it, is not true. And then the second part, of course, is that, well, was it really that good? I mean, when you look back and say, whether it was relationships, education, science, whatever, aspect, and go, was it really as good as you're making it out to be? Right. And most of the time, the answer is no, it's not.
Well, to me, it doesn't so much matter if it's as good as what we're looking at it to be. We could take examples from it and use it as some sort of guide. Talk about using history and use it as a guide to be better tomorrow. For me, it's not about going back. I don't want to go back.
No.
I do want to reference what has happened before. I want to take stock of it. I acknowledge that there's probably things that people did better in a bygone era than they do today. That doesn't mean that as a sum we're not doing things better. But I guarantee you there was at some point, we did it. We drew it.
Yeah, and you know what? Actually, one aspect that I could actually argue that to a degree is healthcare. Not that we have a worse healthcare now, because obviously we have better healthcare. We just do. I mean, you can argue the advances and stuff. However, I think if we approached and embraced much more of the holistic stuff that was swept under the rug by society, like you talk about Far East medicine, Native American medicine, those concepts, some of the things that they knew, how many times do we find that we've just discovered a new drug, and when you break it down, it was the same thing, the concoction that the shaman was using, wherever, when they actually mixed the natural ingredients and found out that it was essentially the same properties of what we thought we just discovered to be able to handle headaches for something. I'm just making this up. Well, that was one of those times where you're right. It's kind of like, well, again, we found it. it's still around, it's still here, so it wasn't. But had we paid attention to it, maybe if we had gone back, or actually, that's the thing. It isn't that we didn't go back, it's that we didn't take it with us. We didn't amplify it. We didn't recognize it all along. We shoved it, we suppressed it. But that goes to my point, though, that it didn't go away, but we suppressed it. So we don't have to go back and take everything that was with it. We just have to make sure that the good things from the past, we recognize them now. We recognize them in the here and now.
Right. Exactly. And I don't think you should go back. Maybe a good way to juxtapose it is you could look back. I would look back. I look back all the time. Yeah. I see, well, did this work? Did this not work? Did I miss something? I think that's good. And then sometimes nostalgia is a good thing. And nostalgia because... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's why I use a very
mangled nostalgia.
Mangled nostalgia.
Yeah. Because sometimes, let's say something wasn't as good as you remember it to be, or was like in real life, but you remember it being better, so now you want to emulate the thing that you in your mind is thinking is better.
Right.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, believe me, I'm a big fan of Norman Rockwell. I look back and I go, I would love, quote unquote, and this sounds totally contradictory, to go back to a time like Norman Rockwell pictures, the artist and his pictures and what he did. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I would love to have that small town and all that stuff.
Well, you can look at it.
Right. And that's funny because, so what do I do now? Well, I want to recreate that, but not with all of the parameters of then. I want to take what I feel is the good parts, the parts that I like, and do it with what we have now. Mm-hmm. And so that's the point. But when I say go back, I'm talking about people that legitimately want to go back to a way of thinking, to a way of being, to a way of acting that was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago or something like that. Because they mean it in very much a literal sense, because they believe that then this... If they go back to that, then they're going to have better relationships. The world's going to have better relationships. If they go back to that time, then there's going to be better, X, Y, Z. They mean it in a literal sense. And that's what scares me.
I think it's because, these people are scared too. That's what we have to recognize is these people are scared too. And they're afraid that whatever they value or whatever they see as bad, they see that the value, or they feel that the values are becoming less and less important, and the stuff that they fear is rising in intensity.
Right. They fear that. That's
right. So that's why I don't think that these people are necessarily quote unquote wrong or inherently bad. They're just afraid of what's happening, and they're communicating that, and they're expressing their fears. And when somebody's doing that in an open way, I am totally fine with that. I'd love to have those conversations and talk about it and, see maybe I'm missing something, maybe you're missing something. Right. It doesn't really matter. I want to have those conversations. But when somebody, like what we saw a few times in the comments on your Facebook post, is not everybody's necessarily trying to be open or upfront with it.
You know what? I had 3 variations now that you think about it. I had 3 themes to the responses. I had one, which was actually just somewhat of a pessimistic / realistic thinking that, the thought is that we're probably not going to ever get where we really want to be or where we should be. And I'll keep trying, but I don't have a lot of hope for it. Okay, that's better than, that we're never going to, so to speak, or trying to go back. It wasn't necessarily, it wasn't I want to go back to a time because I feel that time was better. It was more of a, I guess this is what it is. We'll take it for what it is, try to make the best of it, move on.
Right.
Okay. There was one that was actually very much at the beginning saying, well, no, we do need to go back. We need to go back to a time where these were the morals that were better, the ethics, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I responded with kind of the progressive thing, saying, so you don't think that we're better off now than we were then with some of these things? And it triggered what I was hoping for, that thought of, well, what are you looking for? Because I specifically said, I think if you don't feel that today, in general, as a general statement, we're better off today than we were in the past, then you're either not looking for it or you're ignoring it. And they came back with, these are the things that I believe. And it was XYZ with just different statements. And all of those were timeless almost. They were talking about family structure, the place, the role that religion plays and stuff like that. And it was kind of like, okay, like you said, they communicated differently. And I agreed. I said, you know what? Not exclusively, but yeah, I can agree with that. But that's has nothing to do with going back, because you could do all of those things here and now.
True, but to these to some people.
Let me finish
Okay,
the third
yeah,
one,
go ahead.
And then the third one was one that was like gripping hard about. But we're not better off, and we have to go back to a time, because if we don't, are you saying that we should just disregard everything from the past? Because right now, if we do that, then the current state is bad, and we can't keep it going bad. And if we don't look to the past, we're never, and it was that, like you said, that attack almost, or setting it up for an attack response.
Right.
And it was funny because that was literally the spectrum of answers. Go ahead.
That is interesting to have gotten all three of those and like seen.
That was the themes for them, yeah.
Right. A lot of these people are so used to being attacked for quote unquote conservative values that they're gonna take the offense right away.
Yeah.
And
one changed. Or one
didn't change.
No.
Expressed. Yeah,
correct. One actually. You're right. He didn't change, but he was able. He reframed it. Reframed. Yeah, basically, his point, and that was completely like absolutely. We kind of agreed. We kind of disagreed, but it was. You're right. But again, you're right. It was the trigger of the communication that we had. We had a communication.
Right.
He was looking for it, or he was open to it. I engaged.
It was an open dialogue.
Right.
And the open dialogue is the most important part to me. But again, like, it's so going to this, and then plus these people that say, oh, we need to go back. Again, like, it comes from the fear of
what changed.
They don't, not even so much, kind of change, but it's not so much the change. It's the devaluation. Is that even a word? The devaluing of.
I think they both are.
Of like quote unquote important or healthy lifestyles. So these like
but my fundamental difference in that is that
it's important to understand that.
No, I do understand that, but again, it's as everything does, especially with ours. We talk about critical thinking, personal responsibility, decision making, and that what I like to do, what I'm trying to do, whether it's the coaching, the classes, this podcast, my posts and stuff, is about provoking thought from different perspectives. I'm not actually, like I mentioned to you, there was a time and place where I was trying to convince. I was actually trying to make the point be right, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I realized, and this is relatively recently, that that's not really what I've ever wanted. It's never ever what I truly wanted. What I always wanted, and what I definitely want now, is to spark a conversation, to actually show a different perspective. And that was the point of this. And even with that person that was responding with, well, then, so you don't agree with, XYZ, and you don't agree, and this whole list of things. And I wasn't going to engage with that. I wanted them mainly I put my post out there to show you have a choice. Mm-hmm. You literally have a choice. And when people talk about tradition, nostalgia, or heritage, and that goes back down to kind of the Confederate flag and the South and stuff like that. When you say those things, you have a choice. Why? I want you to put, like we talked about the mirror earlier. Mm-hmm. Why? Why do you want to go back? Well, because it was a better time then. And that's fundamentally, I believe fundamentally, it's not. It's what choices you're making in the here and now.
Right. That's your thought, though.
Well,
if we're accepting everybody's perspective, or not even accepting, but if we're asking for perspectives and welcoming perspectives and trying to see things in different ways,
I think you're missing my point. I know I'm understanding their perspective. What I'm doing is literally poking it, saying, why? I mean, why do they feel like? Asking them. I'm challenging them to their own thought process.
I know. And
see, this is where I'm moving past what you're talking about. I do know why they said that. I already understand why they said XYZ. I already understand that perspective. I get it. I may agree with it. I may not. Either way, I'm still going to challenge that thought process. I'm challenging their
right.
the critical thinking behind it. And when someone comes back and it's like in an attack mode on social media, that's not the place to necessarily engage with it. If we were in person, like if it was a client or it was a student, something like that, and maybe that's what maybe I should have cleared that up with you. It'd be a totally different comment, a totally different ball game, because then I would be much more empathetic, and I would be like, okay, you know what you said, because you made a good point about always pulling out the positive something. And what I did in that response is I pulled the positive out, but I didn't follow it up with the however, which is really the best way to be able to say.
Because otherwise it just comes off as passive aggressive.
Or just, or condescending or stuff like that. And you're right. On social media, for the most part, there's so many limitations. And I think I'm starting to understand a lot more now that there's so many limitations that people don't want to think that there is. But there really is. There really is limitations, restrictions on how you can communicate. So there's only so far you can go in a conversation.
Right.
And I'm more about kind of a not a hit and run, but more of a.
That's a funny term. Just
the hit and run.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like a hit
I know what
and
it means. It's like you address something and then you run away.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like it's not a hit and run because I'll stay with it, but more of a. I'm trying to think of another phrase, but essentially, here it is. This is why I said it. This is what I'll defend it with. And it's designed literally to make you go, to elicit a response. Right. And it did. And one of the people kind of realized that, okay, I see where it was basically okay, I get what you're saying. I'm fine with that. They basically said, I'm fine with that. But they said, but I'm holding to this.
Right.
Perfect. Because it moved them past the whole, well, the past is better than today. It's not. The past isn't necessarily better today. It's just how you make it. And then the other person was just kind of middle of the road. But the other person still believes that we need to go back. We need to reach back and pull these beliefs and pull them out of the past and bring them into today. And that the basic premise of my stuff is that, no, we don't have to go back and pull them in today. They're already here. We just need to use them or form them or be able to use them in the way that you want to use them now. Adapt them. We just need to adapt them to the way. We don't need to go back to the past to do it. They're already here. Mm-hmm. Basic stuff. Trustworthiness, responsibility. Those aren't any less now. Everybody knows about them. Now, do some people take advantage of it? Yes, and I think we see that more now because of communication and technology. I think the same was true back then. People used to talk about the huckster that came through town, and then he would con people, and then all of a sudden he was caught. What did he do? Moved on to the next town. Right. It's the same thing now. You have an internet person who's, you got pyramid schemes or whatever you want to call. It's the same thing. It is the same cycles over and over and over again. We just know about them more now. They're more exposed.
The scales get bigger too, though.
Yeah,
which is why certain things become more important today than they would have been in the past.
The damage, yes, I agree with you there. The damage can be much greater. Yes, I have. That is definitely true.
That's true, though. But,
no,
I feel like the conversation has reached a good
like I said, we started this with the fact that we ultimately actually agree. As far as like what our concept is, and I think this is whether you want to call it generational or not. I understand where you're coming from, where what you see at your point in life and the demographics that you're with. Tell me if it's wrong, but it scares you in a way.
Yeah, I am. I mean, scared might be a little bit of a heavy word, but I do see a lot of things that I don't agree with. And that's not to say necessarily like socially. Like obviously, I agree with what's going on right now and the marches and all that stuff, 100%. But there are certain things, and then as far as like family, we talked a lot about family values. Just to clarify my stance on that, like I don't think that we should go back and to the 50s or anything like that. I don't believe that, but I do think there are a lot of people, like we mentioned earlier, that are basically saying, "Oh, well, this never worked. I'm throwing this away. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Consequences be damned." And that is something that I don't agree with that. And that's why I feel like we can learn good things from what has happened in the past, apply them in the way that they should have been applied, and, use those as more of a template for today.
Yeah, I agree. I think the fundamental difference, I keep coming back to that, is that one aspect when we talk about this go back and the heritage, and like I said, we never even really touched on the South and the Confederate flag, and because if you actually dig deep into what those meanings are, they're bad, and we won't go any further, but you can go ahead and argue about all the things that you want to argue about, ways of life and stuff like that, but when it gets down to it, when you get down to the base levels of that, it's bad. And it just begs the question as to, well, then why would you want that? And then psychologically, you can explain basically why. There's tons of psychological reasons why you would. But so when I hear that, and when I say I don't want to go back, and I don't want people to use that phrase to justify heritage and that those things, is that a lot of people, whether they're misguided or intentional, they mean it in a literal sense, that they want to go back. I don't mean time travel, but they, in a literal sense, mean they want to pull out those things because they literally believe that it was a better time. And that is dangerous, because I think that is this first step into going backwards and or stalling. We can even just say stalling if you want to talk about just, you can't go backwards. Okay, stalling. So I would like to eliminate that as much as possible, that thought process, and to make it and flip it on its ear to say that we don't need to do that. What we do need to do is recognize there's good things from the past, like you said, take those and recognize them now, because they didn't go away. They're still here. Recognize them, use them in a better way.
I think it's also important just to add on to that, but there are certain good things, just because they didn't go away doesn't mean they weren't diminished. So I think that if somebody were to say, I want more of this good thing, it wouldn't be wrong for saying so.
No, and amplify it. Yes, I agree. And amplify it now. Yes, I totally agree.
Because there are certain things that are diminished that maybe shouldn't be.
And it's ironic because I keep hearing this phrase that, baby with the bathwater. It's kind of funny because that's exactly what, to me, is like you're actually doing, is that you're taking today and throwing it all out in order to go back.
That's the problem with absolutes in general, is and this is why I have such an issue with the macro worldview. And we've always talked. I believe that we are at a point where things are almost on a blanket level good enough to where we don't need to worry about everything anymore. We need to we need to focus on individual things and build those up.
Right, but that comes back to where we agree on is the personal responsibility. I guess we're approaching the problem from just two different directions, but with the same answer. Because I feel like if you look at things from the big picture, and in order to get to that picture, the big picture that you want, it has to be about the individuality, accountability, personal responsibility, critical thinking, and decision making, in order to get that big picture. And you, if I'm saying the same thing, it's the exact same thing, except that you're saying in order to get to the immediate, like that micro issue, we have to take personal responsibility.
Right. We all agree on what to do. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and if you do enough of what you're talking about, those little things, taking care of what the issues are right at hand right now, it will create the big picture that I'm talking about.
And I just think that when people, not saying you, but I think that when people focus more so on the big picture, they miss out on certain details that would have been essential to completing that big picture.
No, and I cannot argue that, because even for myself, Austin, I've said that a lot, where I see things from so many different perspectives that what's obvious right in front of me, I can miss.
Right.
I've always said that. So, and that's exactly what you just said.
And me too. We had that.
Well, it's the flip side. It's like, if you're so narrow-minded and looking at something so specifically, you may lose sight of the fact that, okay, maybe if I make this decision, or maybe if I was only dealing with the here and now, this is the decision I would make. However, there isn't just the here and now, and therefore, but that's the crux of it, is that how much of it do you make a decision on the here and now versus the quote unquote big picture?
Right.
That, and that's the crux of it. So, all right. So there we go. We filled up that one.
That was significantly less heated than the discussion we had about it beforehand.
We got the heatedness out because I think that's the only bad thing about when we do it in first is that we kind of we already know where the other person's going to come from.
Well,
and you kind of.
I don't think we really knew this was the direction it was going to go when it first started. I don't think he expected me to disagree with some of the things that he was reading, and then Well,
and just to wrap that up in just a couple minutes, and he, Austin, to his credit, was making a very good point. He was taking literal the literal statements, the words themselves, and in and of himself, and what was said was kind of things that you couldn't argue with. But I didn't give him a chance to actually contextualize it, and so I jumped on him because he wasn't contextualizing it and realizing what the person's meaning, the communication, what they were meaning behind it, which became obvious when you put it in a whole. And so that was my fault. So that's where we got heated because I was like, no, you're not seeing it and stuff. Right. And then all of a sudden it was kind of like at some point I saw what he was doing and he saw where I was talking about and it kind of deflated. But it was good though for the point of what we were trying to get today. So anyway, as usual, we're going to end this with the think more, care more, live more. And remember, you can change your life. We can change the world one decision at a time. Yeah, anything else?
No, that's good.
Good?
Good.
Good. Hey.
Oh, God.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening, and we will talk with you next time.